I never thought the sound of laughter could hurt more than betrayal itself. But that night, as my husband sat across the table smirking, his laughter felt like a blade pressing into my chest. He wasn't laughing at a joke. He wasn't laughing at some silly story from our dinner guests. He was laughing at me, at my failure. Before we go any further, subscribe to the channel, like, share, comment, and press the bell icon so you get notified every time we post a new story. I had just returned from what felt like my last attempt at keeping my small company alive. For years, I had been working on a line of innovative designs, sketches, and prototypes that I believed could change the market. But instead of celebrating progress, I was coming home empty. The investors I had begged to believe in me walked away. My husband Blake was waiting at home, and when I told him the news, he tilted his glass of red wine, leaned back in his chair, and laughed like my struggle was the punchline to a cruel joke. "You should have known better," he said, shaking his head with that mocking grin. "You're not cut out for this world of business. You're chasing dreams that will never pay off. But go ahead, keep pretending. Maybe one day you'll get lucky." The sting in his words was sharp, but what burned more was the certainty in his tone. He didn't believe in me. He didn't even try to hide it, and worse, he wanted me to know it. I stayed quiet, forcing myself not to cry in front of him. The silence between us grew heavier, only broken by the soft clink of his fork against the plate. I excused myself from the table, walked into the bedroom, and locked the door. Alone in the darkness, I let the tears flow freely. He thought I was defeated. He thought I was done. But he had no idea what I was hiding. For years, I had been pouring my energy into something bigger than he could imagine. While my business stumbled, I was working silently on a patent, a piece of technology so valuable, so groundbreaking, that if it were ever revealed, it would shake the entire industry. I kept it hidden not only from competitors, but from him as well, because deep down, I always suspected that Blake cared more about appearances, money, and control than he cared about me. His laughter that night became the spark that reignited my determination. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, and whispered to myself, "You'll regret this, Blake. You'll regret ever doubting me." The next morning, he behaved as though nothing had happened. He sipped his coffee, read the newspaper, and asked casually if I had thought about taking a real job. His words were coated with arrogance, disguised as concern. He wanted me to give up, to settle, to accept failure so he could stand taller as the successful one in the marriage. I didn't respond. Instead, I poured myself a cup of tea and stared at him, memorizing his smug expression. One day soon, that same face would be twisted in shock, disbelief, and maybe even fear. Later that week, he invited friends over. The house was filled with polished laughter, clinking glasses, and the smell of expensive cigars. Blake loved hosting parties because it gave him the stage he craved. And, that night, he used me as his punchline. "Cassidy here has been chasing investors again," he told his friends with a sly grin. "But you know how these things go. Not everyone is meant to be an entrepreneur." The group laughed along with him. I stood frozen, my cheeks burning, my hands trembling as I held on to my wine glass. It wasn't just his mockery, it was the way his friends looked at me, pity in their eyes, like I was some delusional woman wasting time. Blake thrived in that moment, basking in their laughter, not realizing that every word he spoke was fuel for the fire burning inside me. I forced a smile, excused myself, and walked upstairs. From the safety of my office, I opened the locked drawer where I kept the thick folder containing my patent documents. My heart raced as I ran my fingers across the pages, every diagram, every equation, every line of detail. This was my secret weapon, my silent victory waiting to explode. I whispered to myself, "Not yet." But soon. The weeks that followed were agonizing. Blake grew bolder in his ridicule, picking apart everything I did. He reminded me daily of my failures, like he wanted to break me completely. But, while he laughed, I worked. I stayed up late polishing my patent submission, reaching out to carefully chosen contacts who valued discretion and vision over gossip and judgment. Blake thought I was sulking. He thought I was wasting away in self-pity. What he didn't know was that I was building an empire under his nose. One evening, as he scrolled through his phone, chuckling at something meaningless, I sat quietly across from him. In my inbox was the email I had been waiting for. Official confirmation that my patent had been approved. My chest tightened, tears threatened to spill, but I held them back. He would not see my joy. He would not hear my triumph. Not yet. Another wasted day, he asked mockingly, without looking up. I smiled softly. Something like that. If only he knew. That night, I dreamt not of revenge but of freedom. Freedom from his laughter, his disdain, his control. The patent was not just about money or success, it was about reclaiming myself, my dignity, my voice, and I knew with absolute certainty that the day was coming when Blake would realize just how wrong he had been. But what I didn't realize was how quickly the tables would turn, and how explosive the moment of revelation would be, because fate has a way of handing you the perfect stage to deliver your victory, and mine was just around the corner. The first sign came 2 weeks later. Blake came home pale-faced, his bravado stripped away, clutching a stack of papers. His business was struggling, a deal he had counted on fell through, and the cracks in his empire were beginning to show. He tried to hide it, but I saw the way his hands trembled when he poured himself a drink. I said nothing. I only watched, my mind racing with possibilities. His downfall was beginning, and he had no idea. I was holding the very thing that could crush him or save him, depending on how I chose to play it. That night, as I lay beside him, I listened to his restless breathing. The same man who mocked me, who laughed at my pain, was now fighting his own demons. And the cruelest irony was that my hidden patent, worth over $212 million, was about to become the very storm that would sweep away his pride. The clock was ticking, his laughter was fading, and soon, the tables would turn in a way he never imagined. The first sign of weakness came on a Tuesday evening. Blake stormed through the front door, his tie loose, his jacket slung carelessly over his shoulder, and his phone pressed against his ear. His voice, usually calm and commanding, was edged with frustration. "I don't care what it takes," he snapped into the receiver. "Get it done, or we're finished." I stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, pretending not to notice, but my ears caught every word. His footsteps echoed as he paced the living room, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The conversation ended with a sharp click of the phone. Then came silence. Blake slumped onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. For the first time in years, he looked small, vulnerable. I walked over slowly, carrying his drink of choice, a neat glass of whiskey. He took it without looking at me, downed it in a single gulp, and muttered, "It's nothing you need to worry about." But I knew better. His empire was cracking. The man who once laughed so confidently at my failures was now crumbling under the weight of his own. Over the next week, the signs became impossible to ignore. He spent more hours locked in his office, his voice rising in heated arguments with unseen callers. He left earlier in the mornings, returned later at night, and the smile that once flashed so easily across his face was nowhere to be found. At dinner, he grew silent, picking at his food without appetite. When he did speak, his words carried an edge of bitterness. "You wouldn't understand," he said when I asked gently if everything was all right. "Business is a man's world. It's too complicated for you." The condescension stung, but it only fueled my resolve. I bit my tongue, choosing silence over confrontation, because I knew something he didn't. His weakness was my opportunity. Late one night, unable to sleep, I crept into his office. His desk was cluttered with papers, contracts, and financial statements. Numbers circled in red ink screamed of losses. Deals were collapsing. Clients were backing out. The man who mocked me for chasing dreams was losing everything he had built. I should have felt pity. Instead, I felt a cold, sharp satisfaction. The universe had a strange way of balancing itself, and I was ready to tip the scales even further. The very next morning, an email arrived that changed everything. It was from a major firm, one that had been quietly monitoring the progress of my patent. They were interested not only in licensing but in acquiring full rights for a staggering sum. The figure stared back at me from the screen. $212 million. My hands trembled as I read it. My throat tightened, my chest swelled, and a tear slipped down my cheek. Not because of the money, but because this was the moment I had been waiting for. The tables were turning, and the power was shifting into my hands. I stared at Blake across the breakfast table as he scrolled through his phone, his brow furrowed, his lips pressed tight. He had no idea, no clue that the woman he had mocked, belittled, and underestimated was sitting across from him holding a fortune that could dwarf his crumbling empire. Another long day, I asked softly. He shot me a glare, then sighed. "You wouldn't understand. Just keep yourself busy. Let me handle the real problems." The arrogance in his tone almost made me laugh, but I swallowed it down, tucking the moment into the growing vault of reasons why his downfall would be so delicious. That evening, He invited his business partner, Richard, over for dinner. The air was tense from the moment they stepped into the dining room. Blake poured himself a drink before even sitting down, while Richard's face was pale. His jaw clenched. "We're in trouble, Blake," Richard said bluntly, ignoring my presence at the table. "If we don't come up with a solution in the next few weeks, we'll lose everything." Blake's hand tightened around his glass. "We'll find a way. We always do." Richard shook his head. "Not this time. The investors are pulling out, the contracts are dead, and to make matters worse, the competition is miles ahead." My heart raced as I listened silently, pretending to focus on my plate. They didn't know I was the competition. My patent, my invention, my secret was the very thing that would eclipse their fading empire. Blake's temper flared. "We'll figure it out," he snapped. "Don't you dare talk like that in my house." Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He threw Blake a look of disdain, then stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at Blake. His face was flushed with anger, but beneath it, I saw fear. Real, raw fear. He downed another drink, then glanced at me with a bitter sneer. "Don't look at me like that. You have no idea what I'm dealing with." I forced a smile. "You're right, I don't." But in truth, I knew more than he could imagine. That night, as he stumbled into bed, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The moment was approaching. Soon, Blake would learn that the woman he ridiculed was the one who held the power to destroy or save him, and I had no intention of saving him. The next day brought the first visible crack in his mask. We were at a dinner party hosted by one of his associates. The room buzzed with laughter and conversation. But Blake was unusually quiet. He forced smiles, but his eyes betrayed him. People noticed. Whispers floated through the air. Glances darted in his direction. The mighty Blake, always confident, always in control, was faltering. I watched with quiet satisfaction, sipping my wine. Every stumble he made, every awkward silence, was a reminder of the tables turning. When we returned home, he lashed out. "Do you enjoy this?" he shouted, slamming his fist on the counter. "Do you enjoy watching me struggle?" I stood still, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I enjoy nothing about this," I replied calmly. "But maybe now you understand how it feels to be laughed at." His face twisted with rage, but he said nothing. Instead, he stormed into his office and slammed the door. The house shook with silence. I returned to my own office, unlocked the drawer, and pulled out the patent documents once more. The weight of them in my hands was both comforting and powerful. This was my ticket, my shield, my weapon. Blake thought he was the master of the game. He thought I was the fool chasing impossible dreams. But soon, the world and Blake himself would see the truth. The cracks in his empire were growing wider, and I was ready to shatter it completely. The first time I saw Blake falter in public, it was almost surreal. He had built his entire identity on control, on confidence, on appearing untouchable in every room he entered. But at a corporate gala one Friday evening, the cracks became undeniable. We arrived at the event dressed to perfection. Blake in his tailored navy suit and me in a black gown that clung to me like armor. He walked into the ballroom with his usual swagger, but I could feel the tension in his grip on my hand. The chandeliers glittered above us, glasses clinked, and the air buzzed with polite laughter. Yet, for the first time, Blake was not commanding the room. He was struggling to keep his mask in place. I watched him from across the table as he tried to charm a group of investors. His smile was tight, his jokes fell flat, and his usual ease was replaced by forced bravado. The investors exchanged glances, their polite nods betraying doubt. I could see the calculation in their eyes. They sensed weakness. When one of them asked directly about the future of his company, Blake hesitated. Just for a moment, but long enough to shatter the illusion. He stammered through an answer, his voice cracking with a nervous laugh. The investors smiled politely, but I knew in that instant that Blake's empire was bleeding out before everyone's eyes. I took a sip of champagne, my heart steady. It was a strange mix of emotions, satisfaction, relief, and the thrill of watching karma unfold. This was the man who mocked my failures, who turned my struggles into his entertainment. And now, he was the one being silently judged, silently ridiculed. On the drive home, he was silent, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. I could feel the storm building inside him, ready to explode. As soon as we stepped inside, he unleashed it. "Do you think I didn't notice?" he shouted, slamming his keys onto the counter. "Do you think I didn't see the way you looked at me while they tore me apart?" I set my clutch on the table calmly. "I did not tear you apart, Blake. You did that yourself." His eyes burned with fury. "You're enjoying this, aren't you? Watching me fail?" I held his gaze. "Maybe now you know how it feels to be laughed at." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. For once, he had no clever retort, no cruel remark. He stormed off into his office, leaving me standing in the kitchen with a calm I had not felt in years. That night, while he drowned himself in whiskey and frustration, I sat in my office, staring at the email from the firm offering $212 million for my patent. My cursor hovered over the reply button. One click, and everything would change. But timing was everything. I wanted him to feel the weight of his collapse before I revealed my victory. The next morning, Blake was unusually quiet. He read the paper without a word, his coffee untouched. The mighty man was unraveling thread by thread. Later that week, I overheard a phone call that confirmed just how deep his troubles ran. His voice carried through the thin walls of his office. "I need more time," he pleaded. "Just a few more weeks. I'll find the capital. Don't pull out now." The desperation in his tone sent a shiver down my spine. He was losing everything. And that was when I realized I had a choice. I could stay silent and let him collapse under the weight of his arrogance. Or I could strike at the perfect moment, unveiling my secret and watching the shock ripple across his face. The opportunity came sooner than expected. One evening, Blake invited a group of associates to our home. He was desperate to project strength, to prove he was still in control. The dining room was set with fine china, the table adorned with crystal glasses and silver cutlery. I played the perfect hostess, smiling politely, serving dishes, listening quietly as the men discussed business. But the conversation soon turned tense. One of the associates leaned forward, his tone sharp. "Blake, the numbers don't add up. Investors are backing out. We need assurance that this company isn't sinking." Blake's smile faltered. His eyes darted to me for a brief second, as though seeking stability, then back to the men. "It's under control," he lied. "We have a plan. Just stay with me, and you'll see." The associate shook his head. "You've been saying that for months. At this rate, we'll all go under with you." The air in the room grew heavy. I watched Blake's hand tremble as he lifted his glass. He was cornered, and everyone could see it. After the guests left, Blake exploded. "Do you see what I'm dealing with?" he shouted, pacing the living room. "Do you see the kind of pressure I'm under? And you sit there like a statue, judging me." I stood calmly, my voice steady. "I am not judging you, Blake. I am watching you. There is a difference." His eyes narrowed. "You think you're better than me. You think because you tinker with your little projects that you know what real business is." I didn't respond, because in that moment, I knew the truth. I didn't need to prove anything to him. The world would soon see who truly held the power. Days turned into weeks, and Blake's desperation grew. His once flawless suits were now wrinkled, his tie often undone, his face shadowed with exhaustion. He snapped at everyone, not me, at his employees, at anyone who dared question him. One evening, as I sat in my office reviewing the final agreement from the firm, interested in my patent, Blake burst through the door. His eyes were wild, his breath ragged. "What are you hiding?" he demanded, his voice trembling with rage. "You sit here night after night, locked away. What are you doing?" I closed the folder calmly, meeting his gaze without fear. "I am building something, Blake. Something you would never understand." His laugh was bitter, hollow. "You, building something. Don't make me laugh. You're a failure. You always have been." The words cut, but not the way they once did. Instead of pain, I felt power, because I knew something he didn't. I stood slowly, walking past him with the folder clutched in my hand. "We will see who the failure is," I said softly, for the first time. I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. That night, as he drowned himself in whiskey, I signed the agreement. With a few strokes of my pen, I secured a fortune that would eclipse everything Blake had ever built. My hands trembled as I set down the pen, the weight of victory sinking in. I whispered to myself, "The tables have turned, myself. The tables have turned." And in the darkness of that night, I felt the storm gathering. Blake's empire was crumbling. My empire was rising. And soon the two would collide in a way that neither of us could escape. I had always heard that silence could be louder than words, but I never understood the full weight of that saying until the night I walked into the conference room with Blake's team, sitting in tight rows, their smug faces ready to dissect me as though I were prey. He had staged it perfectly. The lighting, the folders stacked neatly, the air thick with the kind of tension that only someone deeply invested in watching another person fail could create. Blake leaned back in his leather chair like a king, observing a gladiator about to be thrown to the lions. He smiled when I entered. A smile that burned with a kind of cruel satisfaction. "Cassidy, I think it's time you explained to everyone why we keep bleeding money because of your so-called genius ideas. We are all ears." For a moment, my hands trembled as I placed my own folder on the table. My heart raced, but not from fear. I had already anticipated every one of his moves. I had spent sleepless nights analyzing his strategy, charting out the arrogance that blinded him, and preparing the kind of counterattack that would rip the ground from under him. What Blake did not realize was that I had been playing along, wearing the mask of defeat, allowing him to believe his narrative so that when the truth came, it would not simply stint, would annihilate him. "Of course," I said calmly, taking a seat, "I will be glad to explain." The room fell silent. His colleagues shuffled their papers, some smirking, others leaning forward as though about to watch a slow-motion car crash. Blake drummed his fingers against the armrest, his confidence dripping into the space between us. He believed that humiliation was inevitable, that I was trapped in the web he had spun. I began with numbers, the kind that looked ordinary, unremarkable. I spoke about revenue streams, operational costs, long-term investments. Blake rolled his eyes dramatically, as though I were a child stalling for time. "Get to the point, Cassidy," he barked. "Everyone here knows this isn't working. You need to admit you failed." That word, failed, hung in the air like a rotten fruit. He wanted me to break, to shrink into myself and confirm the story he had been feeding them for months. But instead of breaking, I leaned forward. I pulled out a sheet, thick with official stamps, notarized seals, and signatures. I held it high enough for everyone to see, then slid copies across the table. "This," I said, my voice firm, "is the patent." The silence that followed was not empty, it was heavy, suffocating. The men and women around the table froze, their smug expressions draining as their eyes scanned the document in disbelief. A ripple of confusion spread through the room as they realized what they were looking at. Blake sat straighter, the smile slipping from his lips as though someone had yanked it off his face. "What is this supposed to mean?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharp, no longer playful. "It means," I said slowly, savoring the words, "that everything you believed was yours is not. It has been mine all along. The patent covers every technological breakthrough your company has been boasting about, and it is registered under my name, not yours. Every cent you have earned from it belongs legally to me." The gasp that echoed in the room was almost musical. One of the executives stammered, flipping through the pages, desperate to find a loophole. Another whispered something about liability, his face pale. Blake, however, sat frozen, gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him from collapsing. "You're lying," he said finally, his voice breaking. "You're bluffing." I reached into my folder again and pulled out the notarized confirmation letters from the patent office, the bank receipts tied to licensing agreements, and the legal correspondence that confirmed the transfer of ownership. I placed each item in front of him like daggers, one after the other, until the weight of them pressed against him like chains. "Bluffing?" I asked. "Tell me, Blake, do these look like bluffs?" The executives were no longer looking at me with disdain. Their eyes shifted toward Blake, filled with accusation and fear. They realized what this meant. Their leader had built his empire on foundations he did not own, and the woman he had ridiculed now held the very key to their survival. Blake slammed his fist against the table, the sound reverberating through the room. "This is fraud," he shouted. "You cannot do this to me." I tilted my head, meeting his rage with a calmness that cut deeper than anger ever could. "No, Blake. Fraud is convincing your team that your wife was incompetent while secretly profiting off her work. Fraud is hiding the truth while you laughed at me, while you tried to destroy my credibility. This," I tapped the patent papers, "is justice." One of the executives stood abruptly. "If this is true," he said nervously, "then our company is in violation of multiple intellectual property laws. The liability could ruin us." Blake turned to him, desperation flashing in his eyes. "Do not listen to her. She is doing this to destroy me. She is trying to sabotage everything I built." But the more he spoke, the more they seemed to withdraw from him, as though his desperation were contagious. The room shifted. The power he had wielded so effortlessly was slipping through his fingers, and I could see it, could almost taste it in the air. I leaned back in my chair, letting him flail. I did not need to convince them further. The documents did all the speaking for me. For years he had laughed at my so-called failures, but in that room, surrounded by evidence he could not deny, Blake was the one drowning. The meeting ended in chaos. Executives whispered about damage control, lawyers scrambled to make calls, and Blake stormed out, his face red, his composure shattered. I watched him leave, and for the first time in years, I felt the chains of his ridicule fall away. But the battle was not over. I knew Blake well enough to understand that he would not retreat quietly. He would come at me with everything he had, with venom, with fury, with every weapon he could muster. And that was exactly what I wanted, because the deeper he dug, the harder he would fall. Later that night, as I sat alone in my study, the documents spread across the desk, I thought about the years I had spent doubting myself. I thought about every smirk, every cruel laugh, every dinner party where he had mocked me in front of others, and I realized something powerful. His cruelty had not destroyed me. It had shaped me. It had carved me into someone unbreakable. The phone rang. His name flashed on the screen. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but then I answered, letting the venom drip into my voice. "Cassidy," he said, his tone trembling with suppressed rage. "What have you done?" "What I should have done years ago," I replied. "I stopped letting you own my story." He tried to speak, but I cut him off. "You wanted me to fail, Blake. You built your entire identity around laughing at me, tearing me down, convincing the world I was worthless. But you forgot one thing: you cannot break someone who already knows how to rebuild." There was silence on the other end. I could almost hear his breathing, ragged and furious. Then the line went dead. I leaned back, a strange calm filling me. The war had begun. Yes, but it was a war I had already won, in spirit, because no matter how many battles he tried to start, no matter how hard he fought, he could never erase the truth. The empire he called his was mine, and I would not stop until he was stripped of the power he had stolen and forced to face the world, not as a king, but as a fraud. The trap had been set, and Blake had walked into it willingly. The morning after the meeting, the air around me felt different. For years, I had lived under the shadow of Blake's dominance, but now that shadow had cracks, and sunlight was piercing through. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, savoring the silence, when my phone began vibrating across the countertop. Messages flooded in one after another, some from Blake's executives, others from journalists who had caught the scent of something explosive. I knew the storm had begun. I opened one email, then another, each confirming the same thing. Word of the patent revelation had spread faster than wildfire. Rumors of lawsuits, shareholder revolts, and potential government investigations swirled around Blake's company. The empire he had built on arrogance and theft was beginning to shake. The doorbell rang. When I opened the door, my lawyer, Henry, stood there with a stack of files. He had been preparing with me for months, but now his eyes gleamed with the kind of energy that only came when the hunt was finally underway. "Cassidy," he said firmly, stepping inside, "they are cornered. We have them exactly where we want them, but we cannot let Blake spin this. He will try to play the victim, to twist the narrative. We need to get ahead of him." I nodded, pulling out a chair for him at the kitchen table. "What's our next move?" Henry spread the files before me. "We file suit immediately. Intellectual property theft, breach of trust, fraudulent misrepresentation. We make it clear that you are not just defending what is yours, you are exposing corruption that has been hidden for years. By the time we are done, Blake will not have a platform left to stand on." The words filled me with a fire I had not felt in years. For so long, Blake had convinced me that I was powerless, that my ideas were worthless, that my voice did not matter. Now, with each document, each strategy, I could feel the power shifting. But Blake was not going to surrender quietly. That evening, as the city lights flickered outside my window, I watched a press conference streamed live. There he was, standing at the podium, his suit crisp, his smile carefully painted back on his face. He looked into the cameras with practiced sincerity. "There have been misleading claims made against me and my company," he said smoothly. "These allegations are not only false, but deeply harmful to the hardworking employees who depend on us. I want to make it clear this so-called patent dispute is nothing more than a personal vendetta. My wife has struggled with failure for years, and I believe she is lashing out in desperation." The words hit me like a blade, not because they hurt, but because they revealed the depth of his arrogance. He thought he could stand in front of the world and paint me as hysterical, bitter, unstable. He was playing the same game he had always played, mocking me, dismissing me, reducing me to nothing. But the world was already changing. Within minutes, reporters began asking pointed questions. If these claims are false, can you explain why the patent office confirmed the registration under her name? What about the licensing agreements directly tied to her ownership? Are you denying the documents we have obtained? His smile faltered. He stumbled over his words, tried to deflect, but the damage was visible. The once unshakable king of his empire was cracking under the weight of the truth. I turned off the screen and leaned back, my hands steady. You want a war, Blake, I whispered to myself. You have won. The next days unfolded like a battlefield. Legal teams exchanged blows, news outlets dissected every detail, and shareholders began demanding answers. I attended meetings with my lawyers, always calm, always prepared, while Blake grew more frantic. He called me repeatedly, leaving voicemails laced with both rage and pleading. Cassidy, you cannot do this to me. You are destroying everything. Do you even understand what you are doing? I listened to his words, and for once, I did not feel guilt. I felt clarity. He had destroyed himself the moment he decided to build his success on my back and laugh while I stumbled. Then came the moment that shifted everything further. An anonymous whistleblower reached out to Henry's office. The documents they provided were damning. Not only had Blake stolen my work, but he had also manipulated financial reports, hidden revenue, and deceived investors. His fraud was deeper than I had imagined. Henry looked at me across the table, his voice steady but urgent. This is bigger than a marital betrayal. This is corporate crime. If we release this, Blake is finished, not just as a husband, not just as a businessman, but as a man with any credibility at all. I stared at the documents, my heart pounding. For years I had wondered if justice would ever find him, if the cruelty he poured into me would ever circle back. Now I held the proof that it would. The media devoured the revelations. Headlines screamed of fraud, betrayal, and impending collapse. Investors fled, the stock price plummeted, and Blake's empire began to crumble. He appeared on television again, but this time his face was drawn, his words defensive, his charm gone. I watched from my living room, the soft hum of the television filling the silence. She will regret this, he said, his voice shaking. Cassidy will regret destroying me. But even in his threats, I heard the desperation. He was no longer laughing. He was grasping at straws, clinging to a narrative that no longer held weight. The man who had once stood so tall was now cornered, his empire collapsing around him. Late that night, as I stood by the window watching the city below, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The years of ridicule, the lonely nights questioning my worth, the endless cycle of hope and disappointment. I thought about the nights Blake had laughed at me, called me a failure, mocked me until I cried myself to sleep. And I thought about the patent, the one piece of myself I had protected, the secret weapon I had nurtured quietly in the shadows. It was not just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself he had tried to erase. It was about showing the world that I was not the failure he painted me to be. As the clock struck midnight, I closed my eyes and whispered to myself, this is only the beginning, because I knew that while Blake's empire was cracking, I had not yet delivered the final blow. The days following the revelations felt surreal. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me, as if the world itself was watching the fall of the man who had once dominated my life. Headlines screamed my name, calling me everything from a brilliant inventor to the woman who brought down a corporate titan. I sat in my office, reviewing the latest news clips, savoring the taste of justice served. Yet knowing the war was far from over, Blake's public image was crumbling, but the real damage was happening behind closed doors. I had sources within his company, people who once feared his wrath but now whispered secrets to me through secure channels. They told me about the board meetings that had turned into chaos, executives arguing and resigning, and shareholders demanding his resignation. He had become a man haunted by his own ambition, a prisoner of the lies he had built. My phone rang. It was one of his former executives, a voice trembling with both fear and relief. Cassidy, he's losing control. He's not sleeping. He's lashing out at everyone. It's chaos in there. He doesn't know how to respond. I smiled faintly. Let him unravel. That is exactly what needs to happen. The next morning, I received a summons to testify in a civil hearing. It was for a case I had already prepared, but I realized this would be my moment to stand in front of a courtroom and speak without hesitation, without fear. I put on a tailored suit, one that made me feel taller, stronger, and entirely unshakable. When I entered the room, Blake was already there, his expression a mask of controlled anger, but it could not hide the panic in his eyes. The proceedings began, and I sat at the table, my hands steady, my mind sharp. When my turn came to speak, I stood and faced the room. The judge, the lawyers, the reporters, and the cameras seemed to fade into the background. It was just me and the truth. "I am here to present facts," I began. "For years, my work has been stolen, my ideas dismissed, and my value questioned. Today, I am not just defending a patent. I am defending the principle that no one has the right to belittle, manipulate, or steal from another person. The documents, emails, and agreements presented here prove that my work was used without my consent, for someone else's gain. The truth is undeniable, and the evidence speaks for itself." As I spoke, I noticed Blake shifting uncomfortably in his seat. His face was pale, his hands clenched tightly. Every word I spoke seemed to pull him further into his own unraveling. The courtroom hung on my every word, some leaning forward in awe, others shaking their heads in disbelief at the audacity of my strength. After the hearing, I returned home, my mind racing with the strategy for the next phase. Blake was beginning to show cracks, not only in his professional life, but in his personal one. Rumors of panic attacks, sleepless nights, and volatile behavior were circulating through media outlets. He had called his parents, his siblings, even old friends, desperately seeking counsel, but nobody answered. His empire, which had once made him untouchable, was collapsing around him, and the man himself was fading into shadows. That evening, my assistant, Laura, handed me a folder marked urgent. Inside were financial statements and internal memos that painted a picture of complete disarray. Blake had attempted to cover his tracks, but the evidence was too overwhelming. He had tried to manipulate numbers, threaten employees into silence, and maintain the illusion of stability. Every attempt failed, and every lie had been exposed. I leaned back in my chair, thinking of the irony. The man who had once mocked my failures, laughed at my setbacks, and treated me like an obstacle, was now the one stumbling in darkness, unsure of where to turn. His arrogance had been his downfall. Then came the most astonishing revelation. One of Blake's closest confidants, someone he had trusted implicitly, had approached Henry with an offer to testify in our favor. They revealed internal communications in which Blake admitted privately that he had stolen my ideas, manipulated contracts, and dismissed my contributions publicly, all while portraying himself as a visionary. Henry's eyes gleamed as he explained the implications. "With this testimony, we can push for a settlement that not only restores your patent rights but also ensures Blake cannot operate without oversight. This is the leverage we need to finish this." The following days became a whirlwind of negotiations, media attention, and personal reflection. I received messages from strangers who had faced similar injustices, thanking me for standing up. I read stories of women whose work had been stolen, of innovators crushed under corporate greed. It made me realize that what I was doing was larger than just my own victory. It was a statement, a declaration that no one, no matter how powerful, could erase your worth. Meanwhile, Blake's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Reports of shouting matches with employees, threats against legal counsel, and public outbursts began surfacing. The man who had once held the world in his hands was now being watched by the very people who had once feared him. I knew that his personal life would not withstand this pressure. And it did not. One night, a photograph appeared in the media. Blake, disheveled, arguing on the sidewalk with a stranger. He was recognized by neighbors, his reputation deteriorating before his eyes. Every move he made seemed to reinforce the narrative that I had been building. Every lie he tried to spin was dismantled by evidence, testimony, and the relentless power of truth. I received another phone call from a former executive. "Cassidy, he called me today. He sounded broken. He begged me to help him, said he couldn't face the board. He doesn't know what to do next." I responded with quiet satisfaction. Let him face the consequences. Let him see what his arrogance has done. By the end of the week, Blake's company stock had dropped to an all-time low. Investors were withdrawing, partners were canceling contracts, and the board had scheduled an emergency vote on his resignation. He was no longer a man of influence, but a symbol of hubris and failure. I attended the board meeting, not as a participant, but as an observer, seated discreetly in the back. The room buzzed with tension as executives debated, shareholders demanded transparency, and lawyers presented damning evidence. Blake tried to defend himself, but every statement was met with skepticism, doubt, or outright disbelief. When the vote came, it was unanimous. Blake was removed from his position, stripped of his titles, and barred from any decision-making within the company. He sat in the back of the room, his face pale and tight with anger, realizing that his empire had been dismantled from within. After the meeting, as I walked back to my car, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and reflection. The man who had mocked me, who had laughed at my failures, who had belittled my worth, had been exposed not by vengeance alone, but by the strength, intellect, and patience that he had underestimated. That night, I returned home and found a message waiting on my phone. It was from Blake. Simple, short, desperate. "You have won. I see that now." I read it, then deleted it. His acknowledgement mattered less than the fact that the world had already judged him. The truth was undeniable, and I had claimed my victory not through anger, but through strategy, resilience, and the power of my own mind. I sat in my office, looking at the files, the evidence, the statements, and the patents that had changed my life. I realized something profound. Success is not measured by how loudly someone celebrates it or how much power they wield over others. Success is measured by your ability to persevere, to protect your worth, and to claim what is rightfully yours, even in the face of relentless opposition. Blake's spiral was complete. His arrogance, cruelty, and deceit had led him here, and I had witnessed it all, prepared for every moment, and emerged stronger, wiser, and unshakable. As I closed my laptop and looked out the window, the city lights twinkling below, I whispered to myself, "This is my world now, and nothing will ever take it from me." The morning air was crisp and clear, the sunlight reflecting off the glass towers of the city, as if signaling a new era. I walked into my office with purpose, my heels clicking firmly against the marble floor. There was no hesitation in my steps, no doubt in my mind. Everything was aligned. Every detail, every document, every move Blake had made had led to this moment. I was no longer reacting. I was dictating the terms of his downfall and asserting control over what was rightfully mine. The first order of business was the media. I needed to shape the narrative before Blake or his team could attempt damage control. My PR team was ready, armed with statements, evidence, and a strategy that would leave no room for doubt. I reviewed the press release, ensuring every word struck with precision. It was a message to the world. Cassidy Thompson was no longer a victim. She was a force to be reckoned with. I called a meeting with my closest advisors, people who had stood by me through every challenge, who had witnessed both my failures and my victories. "We have to control the story from start to finish," I said. "No leaks, no missteps. We present the facts, the patents, the evidence. Everything Blake has done to discredit me will now discredit him. We turn the spotlight on the truth, and the public will follow it." The team nodded. Their confidence mirrored mine. But there was also an unspoken tension. We all knew what was at stake. This was not just about money or patents. It was about power, respect, and validation for years of work that had been dismissed. I had been patient, strategic, and silent for too long. Now, my actions would speak louder than anyone's words. By noon, the press conference was set. The room was filled with reporters, cameras, and the subtle hum of anticipation. Blake's name dominated headlines worldwide, but now it would be associated with one thing: exposure and failure. I stepped to the podium, my posture straight, my voice calm yet commanding. "Good afternoon," I began. "Today, I am here not to celebrate revenge, but to highlight the importance of integrity, honesty, and the value of one's work. For years, my patents and inventions were used without my consent. My contributions were dismissed, my ideas stolen. But today, the truth has emerged. The documents, communications, and testimony presented here are undeniable. The work that has transformed industries, that has the potential to impact millions of lives, belongs to its rightful creator, myself, Cassidy Thompson." The room erupted with flashes from cameras. Reporters scribbled furiously. Microphones captured every word, and the world listened. I laid out the evidence, step by step, showing how Blake had manipulated contracts, how he had tried to silence whistleblowers, and how his empire had been built on deceit. Blake's response was predictable. He attempted to release a statement through his legal team, but it was weak, disjointed, and transparent. Every denial was immediately countered by evidence I had already presented. He could no longer control the narrative. The truth was no longer an abstract concept. It was tangible, visible, and impossible to refute. Following the press conference, my legal team moved quickly. We filed formal claims to reclaim not only the patents, but also the profits generated from their unauthorized use. Blake's assets were frozen, and the courts appointed a temporary overseer to ensure no further manipulation could occur. He was now effectively powerless. The news coverage was relentless. Headlines read, "Inventor claims victory over corporate mogul. Cassidy Thompson reclaims $212 million patent," and Blake Reynolds' empire collapses amid legal turmoil. Social media erupted with commentary. People admired my composure, my intellect, and the meticulous way I had orchestrated this outcome. Praise came from unexpected quarters. Former colleagues of Blake's, industry leaders, and even competitors acknowledged the brilliance of my strategy. Despite the public attention, my focus remained sharp. I knew Blake would not remain passive. He had been cornered before and had fought viciously to maintain control. I anticipated retaliation, calculated moves, and desperate attempts to reclaim power. That is why I created layers of security around my patents, my finances, and my communications. Every move he made would be anticipated, every loophole closed before he could exploit it by evening. I received a call from one of Blake's former partners. The tone was urgent, almost panicked. "Cassidy, he's attempting to negotiate directly with investors. He wants to buy back credibility, but nobody is listening. The board has cut all ties, and his lawyers are scrambling to contain the situation." I allowed myself a small smile. Good, let him realize that influence is temporary. Reputation, integrity, and intellect are permanent. If he had valued those, he would have respected others. Now he will understand their power. The next day, I traveled to the main office of the company, formerly led by Blake. I requested a meeting with the board, not as a subordinate or witness, but as a stakeholder whose rights and patents had been violated. Walking into the boardroom, I felt no intimidation. These were men and women who had once feared Blake, now looking at me with curiosity, respect, and a hint of relief. "Thank you for meeting with me," I began. "I am here to ensure that the transition from Blake's leadership does not compromise the company's integrity or its future. The patents I hold are the foundation of this business. Proper management and oversight are essential to preserve value, protect innovation, and restore trust." The board members exchanged glances. There was a subtle recognition that this was no longer a negotiation. This was a transfer of authority, not formally, but morally and strategically. Blake had lost credibility. I had earned it. Over the following weeks, I worked closely with the board, restructuring teams, reassessing projects, and implementing strict compliance protocols. Every initiative I undertook was calculated to prevent any recurrence of the manipulation I had endured. Employees began to respond positively, inspired by the clarity, fairness, and competence I brought to decisions. Meanwhile, Blake's attempts to regain footing became increasingly desperate. I observed his public appearances, noting the cracks in his speech, the overcompensation, the feigned confidence that could not mask insecurity. He reached out to former allies, but trust had eroded. His empire was no longer a fortress. It was a house of cards, and I was watching it collapse, piece by piece. One afternoon, a journalist called me with an exclusive tip. Blake had filed for personal bankruptcy in multiple states, hoping to shield assets. The move was audacious, but transparent. Legal teams were already prepared to challenge the filings, and the court quickly blocked his attempts. Blake was now publicly recognized as defeated, not by confrontation, but by undeniable evidence and careful strategy. The personal satisfaction of witnessing his downfall was immense, but I refused to allow it to distract me. Every meeting, every press release, every legal maneuver was a step toward not just victory, but the creation of a lasting legacy. I was building more than wealth. I was building respect, influence, and proof that resilience combined with intelligence could topple even the most arrogant adversaries. Late one night, I returned to my office, exhausted but exhilarated. I reviewed the latest reports, reflecting on the journey from my initial struggles, the dismissals, the laughter at my failures, to this moment of absolute control. It was a transformation not just of circumstance but of identity. I had become someone who commanded attention without fear, someone who dictated terms with precision, and someone whose intellect and patience had rewritten the rules of engagement. That as I looked out over the city skyline, the lights flickering like stars in a human constellation, I realized that this was more than revenge. This was validation, proof that integrity, intelligence, and strategic thinking could outmatch arrogance, deceit, and intimidation. Blake had underestimated me at every turn, and he had paid the price. In the following days, I consolidated my patents, finalized financial settlements, and ensured that Blake had no remaining claim to the work he had once tried to steal. The legal and media victories were complete. My $212 million patent was secure, my reputation untarnished, and my position in the industry stronger than ever. By now, Blake had vanished from public life. A cautionary tale whispered in corporate circles. People spoke of his arrogance and downfall, but few could recall the precise details. My triumph was the story that endured. I had not only reclaimed what was mine, but I had transformed it into a symbol of empowerment, strategy, and undeniable success. I was no longer defined by the failures others had imposed on me. I had seized control, turned the tables with precision, and crafted a narrative that would endure. Blake was finished. I was unstoppable. The morning sun had a sharp edge as I entered my office. The city below buzzed with energy. Unaware of the storm brewing within corporate corridors, I had stabilized the company, reclaimed my patents, and cemented my authority. Yet, I knew the battle was not entirely over. Blake was unpredictable, dangerous, and desperate. He had been stripped of power, but his pride and ego made him capable of one last reckless move. I had prepared for this. Every legal loophole had been addressed, every financial maneuver secured, and every ally carefully briefed. This was no longer about proving myself to the world. It was about preventing Blake from striking back, and ensuring that the empire I had rebuilt could never be threatened again. My phone buzzed. It was an encrypted message from one of Blake's former partners, a man who had once been loyal to him, but had grown wary of his schemes. He is planning something. I don't know what exactly, but it's aggressive and sudden. Be ready. I leaned back in my chair, considering my options. This was precisely why I had documented every interaction, every transaction, and every threat. Blake was bold, but I was smarter. I had anticipated escalation, and now it was unfolding exactly as I had predicted. The first sign of movement came 2 days later. News broke that Blake had filed emergency lawsuits against multiple investors and former partners, claiming that my takeover violated unspecified agreements. The media reported it with excitement, presenting Blake as a potential comeback story. I watched the headlines carefully. This was the challenge I had been expecting, the final test of my strategy and patience. I called my legal team immediately. Every claim he has made is baseless, I said. We will respond with comprehensive documentation, timelines, and evidence. He is attempting a public spectacle, but we will make it clear that the truth is undeniable. Prepare a counterstatement and schedule hearings in multiple jurisdictions. No delay, no hesitation. Act immediately. The team moved with precision. Every document was cross-referenced, every contract clause highlighted, and every financial record dubbed. Blake's desperation created openings that could not be ignored. Every false claim he made was countered with undeniable proof. I realized that his panic was working to my advantage. Meanwhile, Blake attempted a different tactic. Rumors spread that he had contacted high-profile investors privately, trying to convince them that my acquisition of the patents was unstable and risky. His influence still lingered in certain circles, and some hesitant partners questioned the situation. I knew that direct confrontation would be required to neutralize his remaining leverage. I arranged a private meeting with the key investors. I walked into the boardroom with calm authority, aware that their confidence in me was critical. Blake's name hung like a shadow over the table, yet I refused to let intimidation dictate the narrative. "Thank you for meeting with me," I began, voice steady and precise. "I am aware that there have been rumors about the legitimacy of my acquisitions and the stability of the company. Let me be clear. Every patent, every contract, and every transaction has been executed legally and transparently. The claims being circulated are false and are intended to destabilize trust. You have access to all documentation. Review it, verify it, and you will see that integrity has guided every decision." The investors examined the documents meticulously. I did not rush them. I let the evidence speak, each page, each email, each financial record demonstrating the truth. There was no need for persuasion. Clarity and transparency were far more persuasive than words alone. By the end of the meeting, the mood had shifted. Hesitant expressions turned into nods of approval, and questions became acknowledgments. Blake's influence, built on fear and manipulation, had evaporated in the presence of facts and certainty. I left the boardroom confident that the foundation of my empire was secure. But I knew Blake would not relent. That evening, I received an anonymous tip that he was attempting to acquire patents from smaller, unaffiliated inventors, hoping to create a competitive threat. His logic was flawed, but his ambition was dangerous. I realized that to secure the future, I would need to act preemptively and decisively. I convened my team late into the night. Blake is attempting to rebuild leverage through external patents, I explained. We need to anticipate his moves and acquire strategic patents and partnerships ourselves. We cannot leave any gaps that he could exploit. I want full reports on potential acquisitions, and we will move aggressively to secure them. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. My team reached out to inventors, negotiated contracts, and solidified agreements. Blake's attempts to build a shadow empire were met with swift countermeasures. Every time he tried to advance, he encountered obstacles that were deliberate, strategic, and entirely unavoidable. Blake's desperation became increasingly visible. Public appearances were marked by forced smiles and shaky statements. He tried to gain media attention by framing me as overly aggressive, claiming that my tactics were unethical. The media, however, had access to both sides of the story. With every false accusation, I countered with documented proof of legality, strategy, and professional conduct. His attempts to manipulate perception only highlighted his insecurity and failed judgment. The final move came unexpectedly. One night, a package arrived at my office, addressed to me without a return name. Inside was a folder containing documents that Blake had used in his last legal attempts, marked with notes, corrections, and strategies. It was an audacious act, a symbolic gesture, and an admission of defeat. By sending me his plans, Blake was effectively acknowledging that he could no longer outmaneuver me. I called my legal team immediately. He has exposed his intentions, I said. We will use this to finalize settlements and ensure no further interference. Every tactic he has planned is now in our control. Prepare a final filing to end this once and for all. The filing went through the courts. It was comprehensive, airtight, and undeniable. Blake had no options left. The courts froze any remaining assets, invalidated ongoing claims, and legally solidified my ownership and authority. Public statements confirmed my victory, and the media reported the culmination of the battle with headlines that cemented my triumph. Even as Blake attempted to negotiate private settlements, I declined. This was not about negotiation. This was about accountability. Every move he had made to undermine, manipulate, and deceive had consequences. He had underestimated patience, intelligence, and strategy. And now he faced the results of his arrogance. Within weeks, Blake disappeared from public life entirely. Rumors circulated, but nothing was confirmed. He had no remaining legal or financial leverage, and his credibility was irreparably damaged. The world witnessed not only the collapse of his influence, but also the precision, intelligence, and resilience that had orchestrated it. I finally allowed myself a moment of reflection. Sitting in my office, overlooking the city lights, I understood the magnitude of what I had achieved. This was not merely about money, patents, or revenge. It was about mastery over circumstance, strategy over chaos, and intellect over deceit. I had faced a formidable adversary, and emerged not only victorious but unshakable. In the quiet of the evening, I reviewed the final documentation one last time. Each contract, each court filing, each public statement confirmed what I had known all along. Victory required patience, precision, and unwavering confidence. Blake had been a challenge, but he had also been a catalyst, driving me to realize the full scope of my abilities and the power of strategic action. I thought back to the moments when he had laughed at my failures, when every dismissive remark had stung with humiliation. I felt no desire for vengeance now. What I felt was validation, acknowledgement of my intellect, my perseverance, and my foresight. The laughter had ended. The tables had been turned. I had rewritten the rules and dictated the outcome. The following day, I addressed my team. This is a victory we earned, not through aggression, but through strategy, patience, and clarity, I said. Remember this moment. It is proof that integrity combined with intelligence is unstoppable. Our work continues, but the lesson is clear. We control our destiny, and no one can take it from us without consequence. While Blake was defeated, the industry remained competitive, and the world would continue to challenge, test, and surprise. But now I was prepared. I had proven not only my power, but also my ability to anticipate, adapt, and dominate. In that moment, I felt an unshakable confidence. The game had been played, the final gambit executed, and the result was undeniable. Blake was gone, and I was in control. Every laugh, every dismissal, every moment of doubt had led to this victory, and I knew with certainty that nothing could undermine the empire I had built from resilience, intellect, and determination. The morning light poured through the glass walls of my office, reflecting off the polished surfaces and the awards that now lined the shelves. The company was thriving, the patents secured, and the legacy of Blake's defeat firmly established. Yet, as I reviewed the reports on new market opportunities, I realized that victory did not guarantee permanence. The industry was dynamic, ever and relentlessly competitive. While Blake had been the most immediate threat, the true challenge now lay in sustaining influence and leveraging the patents to create enduring dominance. The $212 million patent portfolio was powerful, but power without foresight was fleeting. I knew that every decision, every partnership, and every move needed to be precise. The first hint of disruption arrived in an unexpected form. One of our smaller partners contacted me urgently. "Cassidy, there's a new player entering the market," he said. "They have a product strikingly similar to your patent designs. We don't know their source yet, but the technology matches closely. They are moving fast, and investors are taking notice." I studied the initial reports carefully. The designs were indeed similar, but the execution was flawed. This was not coincidence. Someone had gained access to proprietary knowledge. I could sense the urgency without panic. Every breach, every threat, every competitor action was an opportunity to respond strategically. I convened my team immediately. "We have an emerging competitor," I said. "Our patents are being challenged indirectly. I want a full analysis of their technology, their investors, and their supply chain. We need to identify weaknesses, potential infringements, and any connections to our intellectual property. This is not a panic situation. This is a calculated response opportunity." Over the next few days, the team worked tirelessly. We mapped every aspect of the competitor's operations. Surprisingly, there were no obvious leaks from our end. That meant this was a sophisticated external player, someone with knowledge of the market but lacking the foresight to understand the legal ramifications of crossing patented boundaries. I decided on a two-pronged approach. First, we would prepare for legal action if necessary, ensuring that any infringement could be swiftly challenged. Second, we would accelerate our own innovation pipeline to maintain clear superiority. This strategy required resources, precision, and impeccable timing. Meanwhile, the competitors' moves grew bolder. They began securing high-profile contracts, attempting to overshadow our recent market dominance. Their marketing campaigns were aggressive, projecting innovation that mirrored the essence of our patents. Investors were intrigued, analysts were speculating, and the media started drawing comparisons. I remained calm. Every move they made was predictable when analyzed through logic and experience. I knew that haste often led to errors. The more aggressively they acted, the more opportunities arose for us to respond decisively. I called an emergency strategy meeting with the executive team. "They are overreaching," I explained. "They do not have our legal foundations, our production quality, or our supply chain reliability. Their aggressive approach is a signal of inexperience. We will use their mistakes to our advantage. Prepare contingency plans for immediate legal action and simultaneous product launches that highlight our superior technology." The team moved with precision. Lawyers examined potential infringement claims, engineers refined existing designs, and marketing specialists prepared campaigns to reinforce our market leadership. Every department operated in synchrony, executing a strategy that anticipated every possible competitor maneuver. Then, an unexpected twist occurred. One of our internal analysts discovered anomalies in the competitor's financing. Certain investors had connections to Blake's previous associates, individuals who had attempted to challenge us before and failed. This revelation indicated that Blake's influence had left lingering networks, quietly operating to destabilize our progress. I understood immediately that this was more than a simple competitor. This was a coordinated attempt to test the resilience of my empire. While Blake had been neutralized publicly, his legacy of manipulation and influence still posed subtle threats. I had anticipated challenges, but the depth of these connections required meticulous investigation. I reached out to a trusted private investigator, someone with expertise in corporate intelligence and high-level financial tracing. I need a complete map of these investors, their connections, and any potential leverage points they might use against us, I instructed. I want timelines, prior partnerships, and any history of manipulation. Every detail matters. Nothing can be overlooked. The investigation revealed a network more complex than I had anticipated. Several investors had been quietly funding competitors, trying to recreate Blake's influence without direct involvement. They assumed that by spreading resources, they could destabilize our dominance without attracting attention. They had underestimated my foresight. I decided to confront the challenge directly. First, we initiated a series of legal notices to the competitor, detailing clear patent violations. The notices were precise, leaving no room for misinterpretation or avoidance. Second, I began contacting the investors privately, presenting evidence of their potential liabilities and the strength of our intellectual property. The message was unmistakable. Any attempt to undermine us would be met with immediate, legal, and strategic consequences. The response was immediate. Some investors withdrew support, fearing legal repercussions and reputational damage. Others sought to negotiate directly, offering partnerships under terms favorable to us. The competitor's foundation began to wobble under pressure. Their confidence and momentum faltered. Yet, the challenge was not entirely neutralized. The competitor launched one last audacious attempt, a product release aimed at directly competing with a core patent of mine. It was aggressive, public, and calculated to create maximum disruption. I analyzed the launch with my team, noting every flaw in design, marketing, and supply chain execution. I realized that direct confrontation could turn this threat into a strategic opportunity. We prepared a simultaneous product reveal, emphasizing superior performance, legal ownership, and market reliability. Press releases were timed to coincide with the competitor's launch, highlighting our innovations and the robustness of our technology. Social media campaigns amplified the message, reaching investors, clients, and the public with clarity and authority. The effect was immediate. Analysts praised our product as the superior alternative. Clients reaffirmed loyalty, and media coverage highlighted our dominance. The competitors' attempt to overshadow us collapsed under scrutiny and comparison. Their ambitious move backfired, reinforcing our position rather than undermining it. I reflected on the lesson this challenge had offered. Victory against Blake had been significant, but the true test of power was sustainability. Challenges would emerge from unexpected angles. Networks of influence could persist beyond immediate threats, and intelligence combined with strategic execution was essential for long-term dominance. By the end of the week, the competitor had withdrawn entirely. Investors realigned with us, acknowledging the strategic foresight and legal strength that had neutralized the challenge. I ensured that the competitor's failures were documented publicly in terms of product shortcomings and patent violations, further reinforcing the invulnerability of our position. In the quiet of the evening, I reviewed the market reports. Every figure, every trend, and every investor response reflected a consolidation of power and a reaffirmation of authority. The $212 million patent portfolio was not only protected but leveraged in a way that had expanded influence and market share. I realized that the true value of success lay not in defeating a single adversary but in navigating complex networks of challenge, adapting to emerging threats, and executing strategy with precision. Blake's defeat had been the first step, but industry challenges like these tested the resilience and intelligence that defined leadership. I addressed my team with a sense of gratitude and clarity. This was not simply a victory over a competitor, I said. It was a demonstration of strategic foresight, coordination, and the strength of our foundation. Every challenge will test us, but this experience shows that preparation, patience, and precise execution always prevail. Remember this, because our journey is far from over, and the market will continue to test our limits. As the office lights dimmed, I stood by the window, looking out at the city that had witnessed both my failures and my triumphs. The competitor's challenge had reinforced an essential truth. Dominance was not static. Power could be tested, influence could be challenged, and threats could emerge from unexpected directions. But with intellect, preparation, and unwavering strategy, every obstacle could be transformed into an opportunity. In that moment, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey that had begun with laughter at my failure had evolved into a mastery of control, strategy, and innovation. Challenges were inevitable, but they were now predictable, manageable, and opportunities for further assertion of dominance. The empire was secure, yet dynamic. Every challenge, every competitor, and every unforeseen threat was now part of a larger landscape in which my intellect and strategy dictated the outcomes. I had learned that true victory was not simply overcoming adversaries but sustaining control, leveraging opportunity, and anticipating the unpredictable with precision and confidence. The morning air felt sharper than usual. As I entered the office, the city below was alive with activity. Unaware of the silent battles waged in boardrooms, labs, and negotiations, I had faced countless challenges over the past months, each one testing my patience, intellect, and resilience. Today, I knew, would bring closure to a journey that had begun with my husband's laughter at my failure and the secret that would change everything. The $212 million patent portfolio was no longer just a collection of documents and designs. It had become a symbol of strategy, foresight, and ultimate authority. Yet, as powerful as it was, the true measure of success lay in cementing dominance while neutralizing any remaining threats. I had already faced Blake, outmaneuvered unexpected competitors, and reclaimed influence over investors. Today, I needed to secure a final, undeniable victory. I called a meeting with the executive team. Every department head was present, their faces reflecting determination and anticipation. Today is about final consolidation, I said. We are going to secure our patents, finalize new strategic partnerships, and eliminate any remaining threats quietly but decisively. This is not about aggression. It is about asserting control, ensuring stability, and setting a standard that cannot be challenged. Our first move was to address lingering market skepticism. Despite our successes, some analysts continued to speculate on potential vulnerabilities. Referencing the competitor we had neutralized, I instructed the marketing and legal teams to create a coordinated campaign, a clear demonstration of our patent ownership, superior technology, and unmatched market reliability. Press releases, interviews, and strategic articles highlighted not only our achievements, but also the consequences of any infringement. The message was precise. Cassidy's innovations were untouchable, legally protected, and superior in execution. Simultaneously, I began reviewing potential vulnerabilities in our internal operations. Even minor oversights could become leverage points for adversaries. Engineers and production managers conducted exhaustive audits of every patent implementation, ensuring that no aspect of the technology could be questioned or circumvented. Every design, every formula, and every process was examined, refined, and reinforced. As the audits progressed, a subtle anomaly appeared in one of our older patents. It was minor, but could theoretically be exploited if left unaddressed. I instructed the legal team to file a supplementary patent update, strengthening the language and closing any potential loopholes. This action was subtle yet critical. It reinforced our authority while signaling to the market that every aspect of our technology was meticulously protected. Midday arrived with an unexpected communication. Blake had resurfaced, quietly, with a message that was both arrogant and desperate. He had sent an email proposing a collaboration, attempting to suggest a joint venture that would, in effect, give him indirect control over aspects of our operations. I read his words carefully, noting the manipulation and calculated phrasing. He underestimated the evolution of my strategy. I called my team together immediately. Blake believes he can regain influence, I said calmly. This attempt is bold, but predictable. Our response will be decisive. We will not engage in negotiation. Instead, we will reinforce our dominance legally, publicly, and strategically. This is the final step to ensure he has no leverage or opportunity to disrupt our operations. Again, the legal team drafted a formal response, emphasizing the strength of our patents, prior legal victories, and the consequences of any infringement. Simultaneously, marketing prepared a public announcement highlighting our achievements and reaffirming market leadership. Timing was crucial. Both responses needed to coincide, leaving no room for interpretation or delay. As the communications went live, the market reaction was instantaneous. Investors reaffirmed their support. Competitors recognized the futility of challenging our position, and media coverage emphasized the strategic brilliance and foresight that had secured our dominance. Blake's email was rendered meaningless, a desperate gesture in a landscape that had already moved beyond his influence. While the external world responded, I turned inward to reflect on the personal dimensions of this journey. The laughter, the dismissals, and the underestimation by my husband had driven me to secrecy, strategy, and relentless action. Each moment of doubt or mockery had been transformed into fuel for calculated, long-term triumph. The $212 million patent was more than wealth. It was a testament to resilience, intelligence, and unyielding resolve. Even as external challenges were neutralized, I recognized that victory required constant vigilance. I implemented a permanent, strategic oversight committee, a team responsible for monitoring emerging competitors, potential patent infringements, and market shifts. This ensured that dominance was not static but dynamic, adaptable, and unassailable. By late afternoon, the final piece of the puzzle arrived. Investors who had been hesitant to fully commit now sought direct partnership agreements, offering terms that reinforced our authority and secured long-term growth. Contracts were signed, negotiations concluded, and alliances strengthened. Every aspect of the operation was now aligned with my vision, leaving no gaps or vulnerabilities. In a rare moment of solitude, I reflected on the personal confrontation that had begun this entire journey. My husband's laughter, his dismissiveness, and his disbelief had been catalysts for transformation. Where others would have faltered, I had thrived, turning humiliation into unprecedented opportunity. The irony was undeniable. The very person who had mocked my failure had inadvertently created the conditions for my greatest success. As evening approached, I received one final message from Blake. It was curt, resigned, and unmistakably defeated. There was no anger, no threat, only acknowledgement that his attempts had failed and that he no longer had the influence he had once wielded. For the first time, I felt the complete closure of this chapter. I looked around my office at the physical manifestations of achievement, awards, patents, and financial reports reflecting a $212 million portfolio secured and expanded. Yet, the true satisfaction lay not in the numbers but in the demonstration of strategy, intellect, and unwavering resolve. The journey had been as much about personal transformation as professional success. With the city lights beginning to illuminate the skyline, I addressed my team one final time. "This is more than victory," I said. "It is a testament to preparation, resilience, and vision. We have faced challenges that seemed insurmountable, competitors who tested our limits, and attempts to undermine our authority. Every step has been an opportunity to assert dominance and create long-term security. Remember this approach in every decision, every negotiation, and every innovation moving forward." The team responded with nods, acknowledgement, and a quiet pride that matched my own. The office, usually a place of relentless activity and tension, now felt like a sanctuary of accomplishment. Every individual understood the magnitude of what had been achieved and the lessons embedded in the journey. As night fully settled, I stood by the window once more, looking at a city that had both challenged and witnessed my transformation. The laughter that had once threatened to diminish me was now replaced with absolute confidence. The $212 million patent portfolio was not only secured but had become a platform for unprecedented growth and authority. Every challenge, every competitor, and every obstacle had been anticipated, neutralized, and transformed into opportunity. In that final moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity and empowerment. The journey had been defined by intellect, foresight, and unwavering determination. Humiliation had been transformed into triumph, underestimation into leverage, and challenge into mastery. The laughter that had once echoed as ridicule was now a distant memory, replaced by a legacy that could not be questioned or undermined. Victory, I realized, was never about a single confrontation. It was about strategy, resilience, and the ability to anticipate, adapt, and assert authority at every turn. The journey had tested every aspect of my intellect, patience, and vision. The outcome was definitive: total triumph, complete control, and the final establishment of dominance that could withstand any future challenge. Blake was neutralized, competitors were subdued, investors were aligned, and the $212 million patent portfolio was leveraged to its maximum potential. Cassidy's transformation from the woman underestimated and ridiculed to an authoritative, strategic force was complete. Every element of challenge had been confronted, every risk managed, and every opportunity exploited. The journey that began with mockery had ended in absolute victory, marking a definitive conclusion to a story of resilience, intelligence, and strategic mastery.